Hello, and welcome again to our American Slavery class. This is our third class in the series, and glad to have you back with us. I'm going to share my screen and our slides, and we'll get started. When we ended last session, we were just really getting into the transatlantic slave trade. And we spent some time looking at the slave voyages database, again, from Emory University. And I do hope you've taken an opportunity to use the link provided. We won't have time in this class to really explore as much as I'd like to, but I do hope you take that opportunity. It is a marvelous collection of information that is the finest bit of collaborative work among historians and others in the field that several universities involved, and it has not only wonderful graphics but marvelous essays and just again a treasure trove of information the on the slave trade. So let's get into class 3. Begin with a quick summary. We again are focused on the origins of racism as we talk about the subject of American slavery. We looked at the evolution of slavery throughout, from antiquity through the really involvement of the Western European powers, and that's really where we're going to kick off today. We focused obviously last time on the Portuguese, the Spanish. We will talk very briefly about the Dutch and the French. We're going to focus obviously on the British, who, as we said, come late to the party, but are the focus of the colonies that would become the United States after the Revolutionary War. The Middle Passage was covered, I think, pretty extensively in the handout that I provided. And again, that Slave Voyages database is the best resource that I could recommend to you. I think we did look at this video, but in case we did not, I see it's still here. So let me go back and see if we can put that up. Okay, apparently we did. That's why it's not coming. Okay, let's get into the class we have scheduled for today. And we're going to be talking, obviously, about the development of the British colonies that would become the US. And we're going to frame this around what one of my favorite historians, Ira Berlin, calls the charter generation, the plantation generation, and the revolutionary generation. So we're going to begin with this first charter generation in the class 1 handout. I think we explained Berlin's framing of that time period. Obviously, we're going to look at Jamestown, look at the story of Anthony Johnson, an Atlantic Creole. You remember we, in that handout, tried to define Atlantic Creoles. You remember Berlin says these were the children of those who moved between Africa and Europe, and because of their multilingual mixed race, usually the intermarriage between a Portuguese man and an African woman, and their grasp of the commercial and financial customs that operated around the trading factories established along the coast of Africa in the 15th century, they could serve as intermediaries between Europeans and Africans. We had several examples of Estevanico, Esteban. I ended talking about Esteban last week. Juan Garrido would be another example. Again, these are men who were not always enslaved, but had the opportunity, in some cases, of actually accompanying the Portuguese or Spanish explorers to the New World and living to tell the story. And we did look at some of those stories. We're going to again, keep our focus on how race is created, is constructed during this time. It's important to understand that, as we've said from the beginning. And two of the authors, historians we focus on today, Ira Berlin and his seminal book, Many Thousands Gone, The First Two Centuries of Slavery in North America, and Edmund Morgan, his American Slavery, American Freedom, frames that story certainly better than I can. So we're going to focus on them. We'll look at Bacon's Rebellion and its importance to helping us understand how race is developed in this early part of our American experience. And then we'll conclude today looking at the revolutionary generation. And if we can move quickly enough, we'll actually get beyond the revolution and look at both the Declaration of Independence and the 1878 Constitutional Convention and how the U.S. Constitution protected slavery. So let's get into it and keep moving here. I mentioned Berlin. He has been dead now, I think, 4 or 5 years, but before dying, left a marvelous collection of scholarship, award-winning books focused on American history in this era, with really a keen eye to understanding slavery and race and the interplay. Again, he structures at least the one book, Many Thousands Gone, around looking at slave societies and societies with slaves. You'll remember that definition from the handout. And he focuses, or I should say, segments the discussion around slavery in the North, in the Chesapeake Bay Area, Low Country, South Carolina, and then Georgia and Florida and the lower Mississippi Valley. So it's a marvelous work. Commend it to you. It's none of these books are small, unfortunately, but well worth the investment. Just a quick passage from Berlin's book, as he says in one of the introductory passages. He says, race is not simply a social construction. It is a particular kind of social construction, a historical construction. Indeed, like other historical constructions, the most famous, of course, being class, it cannot exist outside of time and space. Race is also a fluency which evades analysis if we attempt to stop it dead at any given moment and atomize its structure. Race, no less than class, is a product of history, and it only exists on the contested social terrain in which men and women struggle to control their destinies. So again, I love the way he looks at the emerging experiences in the different parts of what were going to be the 13 colonies, the creation of this new society based on slavery, and very different slavery depending upon where in those 13 colonies one might live, either as a free person or as an enslaved person. And so he focuses on that. This concept of agency is an important one that both Berlin and Morgan address in Morgan's American Slavery and American Freedom. And it is important for us, as I tried to say in the opening session, that we cannot ever separate the enslaved from their humanity. And again, that's why I choose to refer to enslaved people in that way and not just as objects. I believe this is a passage from Morgan. He says, knowing that a person was a slave does not tell everything about him or her. Put another way, slaveholders severely circumscribed the lives of enslaved people, but they never fully defined them. Slaves were neither extensions of their owner's will nor products of the market's demand. The slave's history, like all human history, was made not only by what was done to them, but also by what they did for themselves. Again, consideration that runs throughout all of our discussions, all of our study, is the role that the enslaved man, woman, and children played in surviving and then overcoming the oppression ultimately to gain their freedom. Let's look, Jamestown. You're familiar with Jamestown from your history, certainly, but let's take a few minutes and look at this Khan Academy segment that is, I think, quite good in explaining sort of the beginning of Jamestown and how they progress.
At Roanoke Island. Talked about the short-lived and highly unsuccessful English colony at Roanoke Island, which disappeared pretty much without a trace, and even today is still known as the Lost Colony. So as late as 1585, England has still not successfully established a New World colony. Well, all of that is about to change in 1607, when the Virginia Company, a joint stock company, or an early precursor to the modern corporation, which spread out both the shares, the wealth, and the risk of an expedition like one headed to the New World. They received a charter for New World exploration from King James I, who had now taken over for Queen Elizabeth. And their goals were kind of the same as many of the goals of explorers in this time period. They wanted to find gold. They wanted to find a passage to the Indies that might make it easier for them to get the luxurious materials like spices and silk that were so expensive to get over the land route that was the Silk Road. And James in particular was hoping that they could maybe get one up on the Spanish, who had been doing so well for more than 100 years in the West Indies. Now, one of the important things to note about this is that no one who went to Virginia expected to set up a colony there and live there for the rest of their lives. What they expected was to go for a couple of years, mine tremendous amounts of gold, which they hoped were, lying in giant piles all over the ground, get tremendously wealthy, and live like kings for the rest of their lives in Europe. So this Virginia Company expedition was intended to be short-term. But, as it'll turn out, that will not be the case. So how did things go for the Virginia Company compared to the Roanoke Island colonists? Well, not terrifically better. They sailed in early 1607 into the Chesapeake Bay, and they spent some time looking for what might be a good place to settle, and they eventually chose a site here on what they'll name the James River for King James, and in the town that they'll call Jamestown for the same reason. It's hard to overstate how terrible the land that they chose at Jamestown was. And it was terrible for a couple of reasons. One reason is that the soil isn't terrifically good there. It's marshy. It's not great for growing subsistence crops, which you'll need to survive. And more importantly, it's buggy. And by buggy, I mean that there are tons of mosquitoes, and mosquitoes carry diseases like, say, yellow fever, malaria, and those mosquito-borne diseases will have a tremendous effect, a huge death toll for the early settlers at Jamestown. The other thing I can't overstate about the colonists at Jamestown was just how incredibly unprepared and unsuited they were to be colonists in the New World. Remember, this was essentially a get-rich-quick scheme. Well, who are the sort of people who'd like to get rich quick? Investors, for the most part. These were gentlemen, and the English definition of a gentleman is really someone who has title, someone who has status, someone who does not work with his hands. And all through that first summer, when they probably should have been planting crops to try to survive through the winter, instead, these gentlemen were busy looking for gold, which means that when winter rolled around, things got pretty dire at Jamestown. And we'll talk about that in the next video.
Very good. Let me get this closed. We'll get back. She made a really, really important point about the makeup of these adventurers, how unprepared and unsuited. As she says, Morgan makes the point, and again, American Slavery, American Freedom, that the poor organization, the planters' self-interest versus the interest of the colony, and the poorly equipped gentlemen farmers spelled doom for a successful colonization. So it would take several seasons before they would get themselves organized, obviously with the help of some indigenous peoples as well as resupply from England. But it wouldn't be until the late mid 1640s when they would begin with the learning how to subsist and then to ultimately start growing tobacco. Morgan says very aptly, he says, if you were a colonist, you knew that your technology was superior to the Indians. You knew that you were civilized and they were savages, but your superior technology had proved insufficient to extract anything. The Indians, keeping to themselves, laughed at your superior methods and lived from the land more abundantly and with less labor than you did. And when your own people started deserting in order to live with them, it was too much. So you killed the Indians, tortured them, burned their villages, burned their cornfields. It proved your superiority in spite of your failures, and you gave similar treatment to any of your own people who succumbed to their savage ways of life. But you still did not grow much corn. I always thought that was an interesting way to again describe the early years of the Jamestown colonists, and frankly, their failures and near near extermination through their ineptitude. Let's then move. Okay, again, Morgan provides, and in his book, he focuses on Virginia. And I think I might have a passage that explains, but instead of trying to give the history of each of these 13, ultimately 13 colonies, he focuses on Virginia. It is the largest. It will obviously end up being the most successful, but he spends his entire time focusing on the development of an economy and a society would ultimately be based on slave labor that would be Virginia as we know it. We talked earlier about the 1619 arrival of the first Africans in Jamestown, and in the handout we hopefully explain the difference between indentured servitude and slavery. That's often misunderstood. And again, indentures was call it slavery for a period of years, usually 7, after which the individual who had completed his indenture contract could become themselves a landowner, and were often given land and a stake, if you will, in becoming a landowner. Let me just read a passage from, again, Morgan, because I think he says it so much better than I. He says, the seeming inconsistency, not to say hypocrisy, of slaveholder devoting themselves to freedom was not peculiar to the Davises, the Jeffersons, or Washingtons, nor was it peculiar to Virginia. He says, the men who came together to found the independent United States, dedicated to freedom and equality, either held slaves or willing to join hands with those who did. None of them felt entirely comfortable about the fact, but neither did they feel responsible for it. Most of them had inherited both their slaves and their attachments to freedom from an earlier generation, and they knew that the two were not unconnected. The rise of liberty and equality in America had been accompanied by the rise of slavery. That two seemingly contradictory developments were taking place simultaneously over a long period of time, from the 17th century to the 19th, is the central paradox of American history, according to Morgan. He says the paradox is American, and it behooves Americans to understand it if they would understand themselves. But the key to the puzzle, historically, does lie in Virginia. Virginia was the largest of the new United States in territory, in population, in influence, and in slaveholding. Virginians owned more than 40% of all the slaves in the new nation. It was Virginia slaves who grew most of the tobacco that helped to buy American independence. And Virginia furnished the country's most eloquent spokesman for freedom and equality. Virginia adopted the first state constitution with a Bill of Rights. A Virginian commanded the Continental Army that won independence. Virginians drafted not only the Declaration of Independence, but also the U.S. Constitution in 1787 and the first 10 amendments to it. And Americans elected Virginians to the presidency of the United States under that Constitution for 32 out of the first 36 years of its existence. They were all slaveholders. It is possible, if it is possible to understand the American paradox, the marriage of slavery and freedom, Virginia is surely the place to begin. So again, this is his focus, and again, I think helps us ground our thinking in how a new nation built on liberty can also acknowledge it was built on the backs of men and women and children of African descent. Anthony Johnson is an interesting story. I'll include it in a handout. There's some description of his background, but very, very quickly, he would be an Atlantic Creole, was enslaved by a Virginia planter, was a trusted enslaved person, and ultimately was able to, because of his indentured status, gain his freedom and become a landowner. What will happen over the course of his life is impacted by the change in the laws in all of the colonies that affected people of African descent. So he is an indenture. When he comes, he gains his freedom and some land, but by the end of his life, he will not only be dispossessed of that land, but his children, who have inherited what he had gained in an estate, will lose it and will have to move out of Virginia. And we'll look at some of those laws as we move through here. I won't play this video now, but perhaps put a link in my email to you. Okay, continuing to look at this again, the charter generation. This is the first generation of what would become Americans. And you start to see the laws change to accommodate the practice that would become slavery. Massachusetts, like all of the other colonies, will legalize slavery on around the 1640s. John Punch is an interesting case. Happens before this law change. Punch and a Scotsman and another European are indentures. They run away and they're captured. They are tried for running away, trying to avoid their indenture contracts. The two Europeans are punished by 20 lashes and 4 additional years added on to their indenture contracts. One for their owner and 3 for the colony. Punch, the only person of African descent, the only African, is determined by the judge to now be a slave for life. This is the first instance in recorded history in Virginia where this, and we don't know this judge, as he didn't provide his rationale. We can only surmise that the distinction was a conscious one, and probably a great boon and gift to wealthy landowners, because we've now established a basis on which Africans, whether indentured or not, would be treated as perpetual slaves in perpetuity for the rest of their lives. The Elizabeth Key case is another interesting one. Both of these stories I take from a new podcast I've been listening to recently. You may be familiar with Scene on Radio, pretty popular podcast. John Biewen is the producer and the narrator. And these stories are taken from a series, I think 14 episodes, called Seeing White. And Elizabeth Key is a mixed race woman. Her white father, owner, obviously has a relationship with Elizabeth's mother, who is a woman of African descent. At his death, he requests that she be freed. His new owner, or her new owner, ignores that. She will marry another indentured African who is from England, has some legal training, and they contact a lawyer, and they file a suit. The suit proceeds. She is ordered by the lower court to be freed. The appellate court reverses that. Ultimately, the highest court in the Burgesses at the time will free her based upon, again, the law at that time. Almost immediately, the House of Burgesses passes a law which changes the method in English law. Paternity passes from the father to the child. The House of Burgesses in Virginia, 1662, will change that, such that now children of a black woman, of a black mother, shall be bond or free according to the condition of the mother. This begins the practice of perpetual slavery in Virginia. Ultimately, all of the colonies will follow suit. There's in reading from the Burgesses' December 1662 decision, whereas some doubts have arisen whether children got by an Englishman upon a Negro woman should be slave or free, be it therefore enacted and declared by this present grand assembly that all children born in this country shall be held bond or free only according to the condition of the mother. Again, changing English law such that now all children born of a African or enslaved woman will be themselves enslaved. Let me move on then. Again, still in the charter generation, and you see a number of laws being passed. We won't have time to go through them all. Interestingly, one of the first documented slave rebellions, Gloucester County, Virginia. Don't have a lot of information on that. I do have some other stories, instances of slave revolts we will get to later in this segment. But as you see, Maryland mandates slavery for life for all blacks, all enslaved people, people of African descent, 1664. That will be followed again by all of the other colonies. And in 1667, interestingly enough, Virginia will disallow conversion to Christianity as a route to freedom. Heretofore, in British law, Christians could not be enslaved. And obviously, several Africans had gained their freedom through baptism. The law passed will change that and essentially allow the enslaver to both baptize his enslaved people and continue them in slavery. And perhaps most grotesquely, the laws turn even more dark toward the end of the 1660s, where the court will provide an absolute defense for an enslaver who kills an enslaved person in the course of correction. All of the colonies will pass similar laws. Rebellion, the Bacon Rebellion. So we now have a situation where, as you'll see, there's a large enough number of poor whites and some indigenous people and poor blacks who've completed their indentures, and they're now banding together, seeking to gain more land, more ability to gain wealth. And let me just play this video. It does a pretty good job of explaining that story. This is Hip Hughes.
Hey guys, welcome to Hip Hughes History, a little colonial history on tap for you today as we rewind the clock back to 1676 and we get ready for every vegetarian's nightmare, Bacon's Rebellion. Let's take a look at the causes that led up to the rebellion, the actual rebellion itself, and what's going to be on the test, the effects. You know it, kids. So let's go giddy up for the learning as we go get her done right now. So Bacon's Rebellion is going to be in 1676, but of course we're going to start before that. Not in the founding of Jamestown. That's a different story, and certainly John Smith, and they had a lot of problems and yada, yada, yada. But after a couple of decades, things start to calm down, and there's an increase in immigration. There's lots of reasons why people want to escape Europe, escape England. They're in debt. It's overcrowded. There's religious Protestant Catholic war stuff going on. But really, this represents hope. This represents a way out. So you have people that are coming over to the Virginia colony. And there's different types of people. There's people with Momo and people without Momo. Now, in the head right system, oh, vocabulary, I love you. In the head right system, for every ticket that you could afford, you got 50 acres of land. So if you were wealthy, you could come over and get a lot of land. But if you didn't have Momo in the head right system, you'd come over owing. You'd be an indentured servant. And that meant you had to dedicate 5 to 7 years of your life working hard labor before you got some land. So that's really the labor system. Of course, there's slavery. The first slave ship comes in 1619 in Jamestown, but the system is heavily dependent upon indentured servants, and this creates a class system, those with and those without. Now, the people that are living on the coast near Jamestown, kind of the Tidewater region, these are the elite, these are the powerful, these are the people with Momo. And then the people without Momo, these indentured servants and others that couldn't afford to live there, would get kind of the not so great land out in the west, the frontier. And these people are surrounded by Native Americans, the Amatoks and the Manchaus and the Oranaxes. And there's 5 or 6 Native American tribes that I can't pronounce that are surrounding them. So by 1670, you have some problems. You have a problem of these people that are living in the frontier feeling as though they're being ignored. They're feeling like they're being overtaxed. They're feeling like their rights aren't being watched out for. And there's other problems. There's not enough women. The women who do come over, much fewer than the men, they're going to be marrying the people that are in the Tidewater region, the elite. Why are you going to marry some guy out in the west surrounded by Native Americans with no money? So there's a lot of reasons why these frontiersmen, these people in the Virginia colony living out in the western frontier are angry. Now you have a governor in William Berkeley, and he is firmly in the position of being in the elite. Not only is he in the elite in the sense that he's ignoring kind of what these frontier peoples want, but he also has a very big interest in the lucrative fur trade. He doesn't want to upset his relations with these Native Americans. So in a sense, he's siding with his moneyed interest rather than the people themselves. And then in 1670, the House of Burgesses, oh, I love the House of Burgesses, this first representative body in the New World, is going to strip these frontiersmen that don't own land, that aren't in the elite, that are poor, of their voting rights. So that's not necessarily going to go over very well. So there's a lot of causes, but I think the main ones are a lack of land. The Native Americans, they're upset with the elite controlling the fur trade. They feel as though now that their suffrage has been taken away, they're certainly being taxed without representation. So they're going to be angry. They're going to start gathering up, and there's going to be a rebellion. So by 1676, we're going to have our rebellion. Things are going to come to a head. And it starts with these frontiers people, the indentured servants, the poor folks, kind of garnering their energy together, a few hundred people creating their own militia to go after the Native Americans, whether or not Governor Berkeley wants it. And they're going to elect a leader in Nathaniel Bacon. Now, Nathaniel isn't really one of them. He's not an indentured servant. He ain't Poe. He ain't Poe. He's pretty rich. In fact, his wife is a cousin of the Berkeley family. Now, what was probably going on is Nathaniel wanted to be in that inner circle. He wanted to be near the reins of power, and he was rebuffed. They turned him away. So he turned to these rebels, to these militias, and they elect him as their leader. Now, it might have had something to do with that he brought a lot of brandy and booze and stuff, but nevertheless, he's going to be their leader. He was only 29 years old. So after they go over the head of Berkeley and they start attacking some of these Native American tribes, whether they were friendly or they weren't friendly, they massacred Native Americans and they start Native American attacks on the frontiers people as well. So that's going to increase. But then eventually they go to Jamestown, and there's a story where Governor Berkeley actually bares his chest to Bacon and the rebels and said, if you're going to shoot me, shoot me. And at that point, the House of Burgesses had already voted to reinstate suffrage rights and to limit some of the powers of the governor. So in a sense, they're giving in to the rebels a little bit, but by that time it's too late because Bacon wants to go full head on against the Native Americans. He wants a commission. He turns to the House of Burgesses. He actually gets that commission, and then he goes to town. And now at this point, he's really looking for the big win. He wants to get rid of Berkeley. He wants a full rebellion. And on July 30th of 1676, they issue what's called the Declaration of the People of Virginia. And this is, in a sense, like the Declaration of Independence. They're writing a letter saying that the colonial government is corrupt, that these are elites, that they have special contracts with Native Americans, that they're unfair to the people. And they actually march on Jamestown with about 400, 500 men. And on September 19th of 1676, they burn it to the ground. They burn down Jamestown. Berkeley flees, and it looks like this rebellion is going to work, that Bacon is going to replace the colonial governor, that he is going to overthrow the reins of power, and then he gets the poops, dysentery. And in October of 1676, he's going to poop himself to death, basically. Nathaniel Bacon's going to die on the toilet. It's a horrible death. Ugh. Nevertheless, that's really going to create chaos amongst the rebels. They're never really able to form under a new banner and continue the fight. And now forces from Europe are coming. Great Britain, England is going to protect Governor Berkeley, and they're going to take back the reins of power. So it's a failed rebellion. At the end of the day, Bacon dies of dysentery, and the rebellion goes down in flames. In 1677, Governor Berkeley is going to return to Jamestown. They're going to hang 23 of the rebels. They're going to confiscate all of this land back, and they're really going to put down the fists of furies. Bacon's rebellion is a failure. But there's always results. So why don't we go take a look at the results right about now. So let's look at the effects, and I think that the biggest effect is going to be that this really is going to expose class tensions to the elite, that something needs to be done. Now, we didn't previously mention this, but Bacon was promising freedom to any blacks that joined his cause, and the idea of poor blacks and poor whites uniting is a plantation owner's biggest nightmare. So while we certainly can draw some lines to the concept of this is a rebellion against authority that we're going to see in Shays' Rebellion, eventually in the American Revolution, and that's going to be a big idea. The bigger idea is that it exposed this vulnerability in the class system of poor blacks and poor whites. So the head-right system is going to come to an end. No longer are elites going to bring indentured servants over and make them do the labor, because it's just going to create too many problems, because these indentured servants are going to want equality, they're going to want the same rights, and it's just going to create more problems down the road. So the big effect, and you want to write this one down on your paper there, kids, right now, is that the head-right system and indentured servant system is going to end and be replaced by the African slave system. Now, slaves were in Jamestown since 1619, but they weren't the predominant working labor force. Now they're going to become the predominant working labor force. The slave system, as we know it, that runs its course through American history up to the Civil War, really has its roots sown at the end of Bacon's Rebellion. So there you go, guys. We hope that you understand something about Bacon's Rebellion, at least a little bit. You could spout out an essay. I hope you can. At least get the stupid question right on the test. Oh, my goodness. And make sure that you check out other lectures. We have over 400 lectures, and if you're not subscribed, I don't even know why I'm looking at you. I'm going to look over here because I can't look at you in the eyes. Go subscribe right now because it's the right thing to do. And always remember that where attention goes, energy flows, and we'll see you guys next time at your
All
press.
Let me stop hip Hughes here. He does do a good job, and he's got some good. These are focused on high school students in AP history primarily. He covers it well. The one point I want to emphasize is this realization by the powers that be that we simply cannot allow lower class white and black people to join together. And you will see, as he says, the number of indentures will drop dramatically, both for this reason, but also events happening in Europe. And you'll see a great increase in the number of Africans. So the slave trade will increase in volume rapidly over this period of time. And what the powers, the big men will do is to offer crumbs to the poor whites and to prevent this sort of coming together of the lower classes. And you'll see this played out over time. They will be given just enough crumbs off the table to associate them with the powerful whites and against the people of African descent. Other examples of that to come. The last law change that's significant here, Virginia will ban sexual intercourse between English or other white women and Negroes, mulattoes, and Indians. This will be the first documented reference to white in the legislation. It reads, "And for prevention of the abominable mixture and spurious issue, which hereafter may increase in this domination, in this dominion, as well by Negroes, mulattoes, Indians intermarrying with English and or other white women, as by their unlawful accompanying with one another, be it enacted by the authority aforesaid, and it is hereby enacted that for the time to come, whatsoever English or other white man or woman being free shall intermarry with a Negro, mulatto, or Indian man or woman, bond or free, shall within 3 months after such marriage be banished and removed from this dominion forever, and that the justices of each respective county within the dominion make it their particular care that this act be put in effectual execution." So two things happening here: the identification for the first time of whiteness as opposed to English or Spanish or any other European. People prior to this were known by their nationality, not by their color. This is a significant change, and equally significant is essentially the permission given to white men to engage in sex with anyone they choose, but the prohibition is targeted at Negroes, mulattoes, or Indians and their commingling with white women or English women. So I'm going to end this section with a short reading from Thomas Jefferson's notes on the state of Virginia. We're going to see this document more fully in the 5th and 6th sessions of our class, but I want us to be thinking about obviously a key player in the development of what's going to become the United States. Thomas Jefferson will be the third, the president elected in 1800, but before that will have a pivotal role in the drafting of the Constitution. So this is from his notes on the state of Virginia, and he says this unfortunate difference of color and perhaps of faculty is a powerful obstacle to the emancipation of these people, referring to people of African descent. Among Romans, emancipation required but one effort. The slave, when made free, might mix without staining the blood of the master. But with us, a second is necessary. When freed, he is to be removed beyond reach. This was a notes on the state of Virginia were obviously Jefferson's musings about Virginia, about the colonies, about socialization, never intended perhaps to be published, but once they were, Jefferson then would have his name affixed to them to protect their paternity. It is shocking when you read the entire collection of his notes. But I add this here for us to understand that, and this is obviously sometime beyond where we are in the chronology, but you'll see this kind of anti-Black thinking that will go into obviously building the founding documents of the nation. Let's pause here for some Q&A before we move on. Okay, let's move on. So plantation generation, and again, I've got a short handout I'll provide. This is again Ira Berlin's construction, the charter generation. We're now moving to the plantation generation, and we will end obviously with the revolutionary generation. According to Berlin, the plantation generation ushered in an entirely different kind of slavery. Unlike the charter generation, populated as it was by Atlantic Creoles whose special skill sets allowed the enslaved the ability to negotiate with the enslaver, to earn and to keep most of what he or she earned by working after completing assigned tasks for the enslaver, and to build community with other enslaved and white indentures, the enslaved of the plantation generation, where it existed, faced a far more harsh and restricted environment. Berlin says the degradation of Black life in mainland North America had many sources, but the largest was the growth of the plantation, a radically different form of social organization and commercial production controlled by a new class of man whose appetite for labor was nearly insatiable. Drawing power from the metropolitan state, planters who preferred the designation masters transformed the society with slaves of mainland North America into a slave society. Remember that distinction we've already covered. Society with slave now becomes a slave society. In the process, they redefine the meaning of race, investing pigment, both white and Black, with a far greater weight in defining status than before. So we move into this new era, 1670s to just before the Revolutionary War, and particularly where agriculture was most important to the economy, which for the 13 colonies would be absolutely true, would be increasingly true in the South in the 18th and 19th, or late 18th and 19th century, but true for all of the colonies. And you see again a great growth in the number of Africans who are brought to the colonies. Resistance and revolt. I've said from the beginning that we would look at examples of resistance all throughout. We talked about resistance on the shores of Africa, on the slave ships in the Middle Passage, and we are now looking at this being played out in the actual colonies. So number of revolts north and south, always focused on the fact that slavery was a national institution. Revolt in 1712, in 1714, and the Stono Rebellion. 1712, you have 23 Blacks armed with guns, hatchets, and swords set fire to a building in the middle of town. As white colonists gathered to extinguish the blaze, 9 were killed by the rebels and 6 were wounded. Militia from New York and Westchester batteries respond. They capture 27, 6 commit suicide, and the remainder are executed, some by being burned alive. So a shocking eventuality that would make the colonists, even at this early stage, their worst fears true. John Biewen, in his Seeing White podcast I mentioned, tells this story in quite a bit more detail. He's identified from the historical records the backgrounds of some of the revolters, some of those who fomented this attack, and it's an interesting story. We won't have time to cover it all here, but is well worth understanding. The Stono rebellion is also an interesting one. So September 29th, 1739, 20 enslaved people, led by an Angolan man named Jimmy, gathered by the Stono River. Thus, the Stono Rebellion takes its name. 20 miles from Charleston, marching toward Charleston, they arm themselves from a local merchant, kill the shopkeeper, and they proceed to the next farmhouse, killing all the residents. And ultimately, they kill as many as 25 whites before they're confronted by a white militia at the Edisto River, where there is a battle. 14 rebels are killed at Edisto, and another 30 would be captured and executed over the next few months. So again, remember, you have a increasing number of enslaved persons now in all of the colonies in the North and in the South, and there will be an increasing sensitivity to the possibility of slave revolts, and actions will be taken by the enslaver, by the authorities to quell these kinds of uprisings. Okay, there's several of these, and I'm going to spend a lot more time. We'll talk about Maroon communities. There's a Natchez massacre. I'll include some of that in my my email to you. The Maroons. We will see and Maroonage is, Maroon simply is a derivative of Maroonage, which is, I believe, French for runaway. And we will see Maroon communities emerge all throughout certainly the Mid-South, Lower South, wherever there's swamps, wherever there are mountains, you will see groups of enslaved runaways who will move into the wild, away from their plantations, and often they will join with indigenous peoples. And as we get into the early 19th century, there are a number of significant Maroon communities that will plague certainly South Carolina, Florida, and you see the emergence again in Louisiana as well. Fort Mose, an interesting story of Maroonage again, and there's a short video giving some of that background. But let's maybe see that. So we haven't talked a lot about Florida at this time. Florida is Spanish owned, and the Spanish indeed, over the course of their time prior to actually selling Florida to what was going to become the United States, would be a constant thorn in the sides of Georgia, South Carolina planters. There will be battles back and forth, and indeed they will offer freedom to enslaved people who make it to Florida. It's believed that the Stono rebels who were trying to get to Charleston and beyond were on their way to Florida. And again, St. Augustine, the oldest, I believe, city in what's going to become the United States, was Spanish run, and there is a history here. So let's take a moment and look at that journey, and then we'll get back to Fort Mose in a moment.
Journey is one of the most ambitious stories that we've ever told, covering 450 years of African-American history, in fact, American history at that.
450 years of the African-American experience is a story that really should be told, because it actually parallels the 450 years of the existence of St. Augustine. African and African Americans were a part of that history all over that period of time, and it's a part of the story that had, to this time, had not been told.
We divided it in quadrants that represent some of the more important episodes or chapters of American and African American history, including Genesis, the genesis of the African American experience, which includes original documents that for the first time seen by the public, the 1595 baptismal record, evidence of the first known African American child born in the United States. It happened here. Second quadrant is Fort Mose, Fortress of Freedom, the first freed black settlement in the continental United States. Very important. It's a stone's throw from here. Emancipation Proclamation, Breaking the Chains is the third quadrant. Emancipation Proclamation was read here in St. Augustine, a dirt lot off of St. George Street before it was officially released by Congress. And finally, the Crossroads of Change, this quadrant that recognizes the important role that St. Augustine played in the passage of the Civil Rights Act, July the 2nd, 1964. So together and in between, we have stories of principal characters, objects, rare photographs, paintings, just about everything that we could amass to tell the story of this important cultural thread.
Well, the Woolsworth counter is one of the points at which the attempt to integrate public accommodations took place in St. Augustine. This is the actual counter, the actual seats, and what's portrayed here is 4 individuals who were young people at the time, and we called them the St. Augustine Four because they were arrested, taken before the judge, and the judge actually sentenced them to reform school. We call them the St. Augustine Four now, but at that time they were just standing up for their rights because they felt like if they didn't do it, who would? They actually paid a steep price for what they did, but I think it kind of opened the eyes of a lot of folks, especially in St. Augustine.
The Fort Mose story was built around people who sought freedom here, and that St. Augustine and Fort Mose were a beacon to that freedom. So ultimately, it became a story of freedom as opposed to a story of slavery. And essentially, we talk a great deal about Spanish history here in St. Augustine. And it occurred to me that the battle at Fort Mose that took place in 1740 was actually the high watermark of the Spanish rule here. So I felt that the story should be more widely known because of the heroism and bravery shown by the people during that time.
We tend to think that the civil rights period was all there was to African American history. But, you know, living in St. Augustine, you get a perspective of history that goes back 450 years. So there's a lot of history in St. Augustine, and that's something that we need to tell the story about, because a lot of kids don't really know, the role that was played by African and African Americans in the founding of St. Augustine and Florida and the United States.
My hope is that all visitors understand that this is our history. So together, collectively, we are celebrating not only the birth of the American culture here in St. Augustine, but what defines us as a nation, the cultural diversity, this multicultural character that has defined us for centuries and has also brought us together at many important levels. That's what we're hoping people will see here. When they experience the interpretation, they will look at this and say, wow, that's my history. I didn't realize that those peoples were part of my history. And understanding that we are all sharing 4.5 centuries of American history.
All right, so let's get, again, a very interesting story. 1681 African and African American runaways establish Gracia Real de Santa Teresa de Mose, the first free black town within the present day borders of the U.S. Located 2 miles north of St. Augustine, Fort Mose was a frontier community of homesteaders who incorporated incoming fugitives, slaves from St. Augustine, and Indians from nearby villages into a complex family network. Fort Mose's military provided Spain's northernmost defense against North America, and the captain of the militia, Francisco Menendez, was recognized by Florida's Spanish governor as chief of the community. When Florida was ceded to the British under the Treaty of Paris, 1763, the free blacks of Mosé, along with the rest of the Spanish population of Florida and their Indian allies, left for Cuba, where they were resettled by the Spanish government. At least 250 British slaves joined the Spanish under the sanctuary policy, and many others fled to the flourishing villages of the Seminoles in North Florida. We'll hear more about the Seminoles in later segments, but again, these maroon communities are important for us to understand when we think about resistance, when we think about the large number of enslaved people who ran away. Where did they go? How did they survive? How, in some instances, did they thrive? And Fort Mosé is a great story of that survival. It's an artist's depiction of what Fort Mosé might have looked like. So let's move to the revolutionary generation in our last half an hour together. Again, this is Berlin's charter revolution, generation, plantation generation. Now we're in the revolutionary generation. Obviously, that era leading up to the Civil War. And this again is, I've taken most of my material here from the writings of Ira Berlin and Edmund Morgan. Let's see here. Got a reading from Morgan, if I can find it. Here we go. All right, so dreams of liberation, he calls it. In 1756, the people of Virginia lived in fear. A year earlier, General Edward Braddock had marched against the French and Indians on the colony's western frontier. Braddock had been overwhelmed, and now Virginians faced invasion. Reverend Samuel Davis summoned them to battle, saying, "Lest Indian savages and French papists, infamous all the world over for treachery and tyranny, should rule Protestants and Britons with a rod of iron." Virginians, Davies was sure, would never give up their freedom. "Can you bear the thought," he asked them, "that slavery should clank her chains in this land of liberty?" British troops turned back the French, and Virginia was spared enslavement to papists and savages. Yet in that land of liberty, even as Davies spoke, two-fifths of all the people were in fact already enslaved under the iron rule of masters who were Protestants and Britons. Again, this is Edmund Morgan. 20 years later, the people of Virginia were again in peril. The mother country, having saved them from the French, now herself threatened to reduce them to slavery through the devious method of parliamentary taxation. With the other English colonies in America, they sprang to arms to determine, as Edmund Pendleton put it, whether we shall be slaves. George Washington, who had helped fight off enslavement to papists, prepared to fight again, and grieved that the once happy and peaceful plains of America are either to be drenched with blood or inhabited by slaves. It was, he thought, a sad alternative, but he asked, can a virtuous man hesitate in his choice? Washington led his countrymen in arms, while another Virginian led them in the Declaration of Independence that founded the American Republic. The starting point of that document, the premise on which it rested, was that all men are created equal and endowed by their creators with inalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. At the time when Thomas Jefferson wrote those words, he was personally depriving nearly 200 men, women, and children of their liberty. When he died on the 50th anniversary of his great declaration, he still owned slaves, probably more than 200. When Washington faced his sad alternative, the happy and peaceful plains of Virginia had been inhabited by slaves for more than a century, and 135 of them belonged to him. When he died, he was master of 277. So again, that great paradox that Morgan mentioned as I introduced him several slides will continue to plague, and I would argue that paradox continues to have import for us today. The North and the South, again, slavery is growing in terms of the number of Africans who are being imported into the colony, and we will see several dynamics happening within society. Obviously, as was clearly stated in the readings, these colonists believed themselves to be religious and righteous and entitled to freedom, freedom from slavery. And at the same time, in this era, you see a great awakening. So between the 1740s and 80s, religious revivals, where Americans abandoning their former hierarchical forms become more egalitarian. The Methodists and the Baptists preached all black and white, but didn't challenge slavery. Enslavers were weary. Christian duty to teach the enslaved and seek salvation would be part of that tension. And we'll see that played out with the emergence ultimately of the Black church that would grow out of both the revolutionary experience and that era between the Revolution and the Civil War. I'm going to not play this video. We don't have enough time. It's very good, but it does talk about, again, some of these tensions between liberty and freedom and how that does not get resolved, obviously, in either drafting of the Declaration and then 10 years later or thereabouts, the drafting and adoption of the U.S. Constitution. You see now for the first time the emergence of an abolitionism. This is grounded in Quaker theology, and you'll see John Woolman being one of the first most outspoken colonialists who happened to be a Quaker and will ultimately convince the Quakers to abandon slavery and punish Quakers who continued to practice. Interesting, Jefferson plays such an important role, as the video, had we had time to play it, would point out, had language in his original draft of the Declaration that gets to this, again, this paradox, this inconsistency. He refers to the king. He says he has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere. So he's blaming King George for slavery, or to incur miserable death in their transportation hither. This piratical warfare, the opprobrium of infidel powers, is the warfare of the Christian king of Britain. It goes on, again, he's making this case against the king as being responsible for slavery in America. That language will not find its way into the Declaration. It is struck, as this video points out, by the other drafters of the Declaration for, I think, pretty obvious reasons. Okay, so as I said, you'll see emerging now for the first time in this revolutionary generation, African-American church leaders. George Liele, David George, and Andrew Bryan will build some of the first churches in Georgia, South Carolina during the height of the Revolution. The Black Baptist movement thrived in Savannah and Charleston. In 1790, Liele will immigrate to Jamaica with the Loyalists, and George will establish a church in Nova Scotia. As we'll come to see during the war, the British will offer freedom to both free people of color, but particularly to enslaved peoples to run away, joining the Loyalist and the British efforts, and many of those people will end up in Canada, not surprisingly. African-American voices will be heard as there are petitions by the patriots against the king. There will be petitions by the citizens, particularly in Massachusetts and in the northern colonies, also making demands for freedom and an end to the tyranny of slavery in the colonies. I'll include a couple of passages, but there are petitions like January 13th, 1777, the petition of a great number of Blacks detained in the state of slavery in the bowels of a free and Christian county. Phyllis Wheatley, and I've used the term Black exhibits here, we will see in the instance of Phyllis Wheatley, but others over the period of time. Certain well-known blacks will be, in the eyes at least of the white colonists, held up as exhibits. So Phyllis is an interesting, I hope you know her history, first published woman of color. She was purchased by Susanna Wheatley as a 7-year-old from the Senegambia, and she's homeschooled by her parents, never looked on as a slave. Apparently, Susanna Wheatley had lost a child sometime before they buy Phyllis. They essentially adopt her. By age 12, she can read Latin and Greek, and English literature is her focus, as well as the Bible. She publishes her first poem in 1767. By 1771, she's becoming well known, and her parents, believing that she will have to authenticate her poetry, impanel a blue ribbon group of prominent Bostonians who will test her to establish the bona fides of her writing. After listening and examining her, they make the following statement: "We whose names are underwritten do assure the world that the poems specified in the following pages were, as we verily believe, written by Phyllis, a young Negro girl, who was but a few years since bought an uncultivated barbarian of Africa." Crispus Attucks, Prince Hall, early leaders in the Black community. Crispus Attucks would be a free man who would come to be known as the first to fall. He and a group of other dockmen, laborers, are in a bar, confronted by a group of British regulars. A fight ensues, and Crispus Attucks will be killed as a result. We're now into the Revolutionary War proper. We won't spend a lot of time in the class. This isn't about the war itself, but about the impact of the war on slavery, slavery's impact on the war. The question, did slavery cause the Revolutionary War? You remember in our first session talking about the New York Times 1619 article, and this is perhaps one of the most controversial issues arising out of that 1619 project. The question was actually put by two lawyers who are students of the American Revolution, Alfred and Ruth Blumrosen, in an article where they essentially make, some long before obviously the 1619 project, they make the argument that indeed the American colonial powers fear that Britain would change the laws applicable to British holdings would impact their right to continue holding slavery. They quote the Somerset case. So let me just read a bit. Somerset attempts escape while in England. He sues with the help of British abolitionists, and then this case goes to the King's Bench, where a judge rules that the state of slavery is of such a nature that it is incapable of being introduced on any reason, moral or political. It's so odious, the judge says, that nothing can be suffered to support it. I cannot say this cause is allowed or approved by the law of England, and therefore the black must be discharged. So Somerset is released by this British court. The case is widely reported, and the colonists obviously become concerned that this is now going to be, along with all of the other opprobrium foisted on them by the British king, this would be one. So this question of did slavery cause the Civil War is a legitimate one, although again quite controversial among historians here in the U.S. So Black patriots and loyalists, again, the British after some time realize that they can align themselves with runaway enslaved people who do run to the British lines, and ultimately Lord Dunsmore will offer in a proclamation freedom to those both free people of color, certainly, but particularly to enslaved people who come and fight for the British, and they promise that they will be freed. This becomes a great challenge for the Patriots, for Washington's army. Washington is initially resistant to allow the enrollment of Black soldiers. Indeed, when he assumes his command, comes to report, meets at the first post where there are a large number of Black soldiers, he's aghast. Again, he's a Virginia planter, not accustomed to seeing large numbers of Black men with muskets in hand. Ultimately, as the war progresses, Washington realizes that he needs the extra force offered by Black soldiers and allows their enlistment, and they again fight for the Patriots, fight for the Loyalists, and you will ultimately see large numbers of formerly enslaved peoples at the end of the war, after the Treaty of Paris, leaving the new nation and going to Canada and other places in the British Empire. The Book of Negroes is a documentation by the British as they are leaving, and recording records of those who have fought and therefore entitled to join the British Empire, and the large number of losses to the enslavers is huge. There will be claims for reparations, and some instances paid by the British for these runaways, or the self-emancipations. And this is a term we're going to see. Runaways obviously is the reference all throughout this era and beyond, up to and through the Civil War. Large numbers of enslaved peoples running away, particularly where there's an opportunity, like in the War of 1812, or in particularly the Civil War, to gain their freedom through successfully running away and aligning themselves with the other side in a conflict. I mentioned Maroons earlier. You'll see a large number of Maroonage communities growing up, again, principally because of the runaways, and many of them will fight for the British. In Louisiana, there is a famous story of Juan Malo, who will become famous for terrorizing planters in Louisiana and in the lower part of the lower colonies. Let's see here. All right. I'll send you a link to this Looking for Angola tape. We won't have time to view it today, but it is actually a Maroon community that is located in Bradenton, Sarasota today. There's a great history there and a great presentation. Discovered this 2 or 3 years ago as I became active with the Asala chapter here. Well worth a visit, and there's a great, I guess it's a great collection of information and history about the Maroon community that existed in Florida around this time. Interesting comment, quote from Samuel Johnson, a well-known English scholar, intellectual friend of Thomas Jefferson. He says, "Why do we hear the loudest yelps for liberty from the drivers of Negroes?" A response, obviously, to probably a debate he was having with Jefferson about the Jefferson and the U.S. Foreign Secretary or Ambassador, I think, to the British Crown at the time. Let's take a few more questions, and we have just a final segment on the Constitution and the protections granted. We probably aren't going to have enough time to get through it, but let me try to at least introduce some of these after we get our questions answered. Thank you. Okay, I've said that there were a number of protections for enslavers built into the Constitution. The South at the time, again, we're talking Virginia being the largest of and most influential, as Edmund Morgan said in the earlier statement, and they will have an overriding influence on the actual writing of the document. Virginians would be the key leaders in the debates and would ultimately prevail. And there's obvious Southern interest and influence in ensuring that the Constitution would allow slavery to continue. Most importantly, the 3/5 clause you're familiar with, obviously. The way in which enslavers were able to ensure, I think, as Madison said, power in their slaves. And so, for purposes of representation and for direct taxation, while enslaved people were not given the right to vote, their owners were given an additional 3 points in three people for each 5 enslaved people, as the calculation was made for representation to the House of Representatives and for taxation. And therefore, this would further strengthen the influence and power, frankly, of the southern states over the northern states. Without this 3/5 clause, Pennsylvania would have been the largest, most influential states, and the South would not have had this power, probably would not have had the power to push past the Compromise of 1820, Compromise of 1850, which would then obviously lead to the Civil War, be very influential toward that ultimate conflict over slavery. But the South will become even more powerful and would continue to assert that power. The Electoral College, again, for representation, this 3/4 clause was folded into electing the presidents, as most of the, I think, first, I can't remember the number, but a large number of the first presidents were from the South because of this 3/5 clause. The Atlantic slave trade, the commitment that the trade would last and that it would not be, as the statement says, migration and importation of such persons as any of the states now existing shall think proper to admit, shall not be prohibited prior to the year of 1808. Didn't say it would be ended, just said it shall not be prohibited. So slavery, actually, the slave trade could have continued beyond, but indeed, by 1808, the Congress would vote to end the slave trade. But this protected, again, the slavers' interest in increasing the number of people of African descent brought into the U.S. The Fugitive Slave Clause, an early form of the clause that we would find in the 1850 Compromise that would be so onerous and egregious. This was a statement in the Constitution that required fugitive slaves, runaways, to be returned to their owners. Again, a protection built into the U.S. Constitution, protecting slavery. Lastly, some key players in this revolutionary generation. Benjamin Banneker, we'll take some time next week and talk more about his interesting life. He was a mathematician, he was a surveyor, and a correspondent with Thomas Jefferson. Banneker put together a very impressive document that he sent to Jefferson, an almanac, frankly, and asked that he would endorse it. It's unknown what Jefferson did with that particular correspondence, but in the process, Banneker writes a famous letter to Jefferson arguing for the the equality indeed of people of African descent, and seeking to appeal to Jefferson's high ideals. That was also a correspondence that was not responded to. What we have on record is a very curt and very appropriate thank you to Mr. Banneker for reaching out to him. Freedom suits. We're going to see, as I said, as the energy around freedom and the focus on liberty and justice would emerge during the Revolutionary era. You're also going to see suits brought. Elizabeth Freeman, Mum Bet is her name, and a great story. Quock Walker brings successful suits in the North, and courts would rule that indeed they are entitled to their freedom as any other man. So you're going to see a change in the way that the North would treat slavery versus the South. Slavery would continue to grow in the South, particularly as cotton would become increasingly important. But in the North, you're going to see soon after the enactment of the U.S. Constitution, gradual emancipation statutes will be passed. Philadelphia would be the first. 1790, I believe, is the date of that. And ultimately, by the end of the 18th century, most of the northern states would be passing gradual emancipation. Interestingly, in most instances, the emancipated person would remain enslaved until about age 25. Older enslaved people would be the first to be emancipated. But you're going to see the expansion of slavery again in the lower South and the upper South, Virginia, Maryland, particularly because rice and then cotton will explode in their commercial importance to this part of the country, and you won't see any sort of gradual emancipation at all, and that will lead obviously to civil war. So that concludes our lesson lecture for today, and again, thank you for joining us. Look forward to our fourth session, where we will cover this area between the creation of the new nation and the tensions over slavery that will ultimately lead to the Civil War. Thank you very much.